So welcome to this latest seminar in the ACE seminar series, in which researchers from across the component elements of the FCDO-funded anti-corruption evidence programme present on topics they have been working on. Now, for information, we record these sessions, so just to let you know, you should have had a pop-up notice on your screen to tell you that we are recording the session. And today we are delighted to have Professor Jan Meyer-Sahling from the University of Nottingham, who is going to talk on lessons from ethics training in the Global South. But before I formally introduce Jan, and also I hope Willeke Slingerland, who's our discussant today, I just wanted to give advance notice of the next seminar in the series, which will take place on Thursday, the 20th of February at the same time, and will feature Tenna Prelek, who will be talking about her SOCACE-funded research on strategic corruption. So one not to miss, and keep an eye out on your socials for more information. I think you're probably going to get some more information in the chat whilst we carry on today. So turning to today, it's a real pleasure for me to introduce my good friend and colleague, Jan Meyer-Sahling, who is Professor of Political Science at the University of Nottingham, and whose research focuses on the challenge of building state capacity, both in Europe and the developing world. Jan is particularly interested in how to best manage people in government, which factors hamper effective management, what actions to take to achieve high performance and integrity in public service. This builds on his well-established reputation as a leading expert on politicization of the senior civil service, both in post-communist Europe and in the context of democratic backsliding. He has an enviable record of academic publications in leading peer-reviewed journals, as well as a host of policy-related publications. Jan's recent work, funded under various iterations of the ACE programme, has looked at civil service management, bureaucratic performance, and anti-corruption in developing countries, including in Latin America, Asia, Africa, and Eastern Europe. But today he's going to be talking about his project that examines the impact of ethics training on corruption in the civil service in Nepal and Bangladesh. Jan will talk for around 20-25 minutes, and then we will invite reflections from Willeke Slingerland. I hope Willeke is on this call. But
yes, hi, Paul, I'm there.
Thanks, Willeke. Willeke joins us from Saxion University of Applied Sciences in the Netherlands, where she's Professor of Resilient Democracy. Willeke has extensive background in the field of integrity and corruption, and her work introduced the concept of network corruption, describing informal collective collaboration within exclusive networks that misuse professional roles to advance their own interests, a practice that obviously undermines democratic checks and balances and poses significant threats to established democracies. So Jan will talk for about 25 minutes, then Willeke for 5 minutes or so, and then we'll open the floor to questions and answers. But please feel free to put any questions as they occur to you in the chat, and we'll try to pick them up at the end. So Jan, over to you.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you for this really very kind, lovely introduction. Hello, Willeke. Hello, GIAs. It's a great pleasure to be able to present to you today. So thank you for the invitation and for giving me the opportunity. Now, I think the talk for today was introduced as Ethical Leadership for Anti-Corruption. And I thought, Paul, we came up with a nice title. But then I'm talking, first of all, about ethics training and what is the potential effect of ethics training on reducing corruption. But in that context, I will then also talk about ethical leadership and how specifically ethical leadership training can actually help to improve integrity and reduce corruption in the public service. The projects that I will draw on are a series of projects really that we have conducted over the years in Nepal and Bangladesh, and most of them were funded by GIA, so thank you again. All of this work is collaborative, so I would like to mention Kim Sass-Mikkelsen from Roskilde and Christian Schuster from UCL as my collaborators for many, many years, and then of course the collaborators in Nepal and Bangladesh as well. Now, Let me start with the kind of maybe headline takeaways, hopefully, from this talk today. So I think what I would like to do with my talk is really to make the case for ethics training as a tool in the context of anti-corruption research and practice. That may sound a bit trivial because it's not that ethics training are an entirely new idea, but as I hopefully will be able to show in a moment, they do not play a particularly prominent role when it comes to ethics training at scale to reduce corruption in the public service. So I think there is definitely some potential to work with them in a more systematic way. And I would focus these trainings on ethical leadership training and ethical leadership development, because especially in the context of weak institutions, which are characteristic of countries and systems in the global south, ethical leadership and working with integrity and dealing with contexts where rules are weak is particularly important, because leaders often have to make judgments that are supposed to be ethical in one way or another. Now, I would have not added political, but the events in Bangladesh last summer certainly have added something to this kind of research. And I've just been in Bangladesh at the beginning of January. In that context, ethical leadership is even more important, because now the rules that we have are, in many respects, discredited and considered to be illegitimate by many. So, in fact, acting with ethics and integrity has become even more important. And we discussed about ethics training in Bangladesh, and the question was often, when, if not now? And I think this is the main point for Bangladesh specifically, when, if not now? In this context, they should really be rolled out on a larger scale. Now, the evidence that I will introduce to you is from ethical leadership trainings in Nepal and Bangladesh. In Nepal, we worked with the tax administration, and in Bangladesh with the police. These trainings, we have conducted field experiments around them in order to evaluate their effectiveness. And what we found is, the good news is some positive impacts on varieties of ethical competence. We also find positive impacts on behavioral intentions and ethical behavior. Of course, there are some questions on how to measure that. And we do not really find much change in relation to ethical culture measures, which shouldn't be really surprising, and I will say something more about this later on. Now, this brings me then to the next steps and the wider implications for action and practice. So there are efforts in Bangladesh and Nepal to scale up these trainings now and to institutionalize them, for instance, more trainings with the police, but also to expand them to other sectors. So in Nepal, especially with the municipalities across the country. So we have some attempt to diffuse this across the sectors, and we'll see how this goes. Definitely the ambition is there. Now, with this in mind, let me start first with a few words about why, focusing so much on ethics training. In this context of the wider literature and research and experience, practical experience with anti-corruption policies and the often bemoaned failure, or let's say very selective and limited success of anti-corruption policies in the global south, it is quite interesting, I think, that even though ethics training does figure in all these toolkits and in the literature, but it doesn't have a very prominent standing there. Most of the time, it's associated with training the staff, for instance, of anti-corruption agencies, or training journalists who then work in the media and can work as investigative journalists, maybe judiciary. But generally, like rolling out ethics training on a large scale across the public service isn't really part of any of the toolkits and doesn't appear very much in the literature either. So we were, in a way, very surprised when we started to work on this ourselves. Now, there is another body of literature, which, these two do not always talk to each other, but Willeke, coming from the Netherlands, obviously, there they do. And it's about ethics training or ethics and integrity management. And that body of literature, their ethics training is, of course, very prominent as a key component of ethics programs. It's often assessed in the context of private sector management studies, also in the public sector. But then if you look at ethics training, you have very few assessments of ethics trainings in the public sector. Most of them are actually private sector evaluations, and often they are with students, where you then see teachers evaluating their own ethics training. They do provide promising results, but then what we don't really have is much uptake in the Global South. And so this was for us a kind of like the starting point to design and implement an ethics training with a focus on leadership for Global South, a Global South context, and then to assess this using field experiments in order to have more robust evidence of whether they actually work. With this in mind, the two projects that we ran were with the police force in Bangladesh and the tax administration in Nepal. Now, the police force in Bangladesh is in many respects an extreme case because by various publications, law enforcement is singled out as an area of systemic corruption or the most corrupt sector in the country. It is also quite notable that there has been a long-standing lack of reform. I mean, the Police Act that is in force was adopted by the British in 1861. There have been years and years of police reform that usually haven't really been successful. So it's a kind of a pretty hard case. Now, in the current context, these reform efforts are revisited, so that might change in due course. We did run the training there already in 21 and 22 with police officers in one district, and we focused on street-level police officers because these are the ones that meet citizens on a day-to-day basis, and that's where this systemic corruption is really happening. In the tax administration in Nepal, I mean, that is quite a different context because in the Nepali administration, I mean, I guess it's fair to say that the tax is one of the islands of excellence. I mean, don't want to push this too much, but it's certainly one of the much better equipped and resourced and more competent institutions. And what is interesting also that as a result, in part, of the first GIA's project that we ran in 2016 to 18, funded by DFID at that time, and the British Academy, the tax administration adopted an IRD or a tax-specific code of ethics. There is a code of ethics for the civil service, but they added one for their own administration, and they wanted to do trainings as a result of that. So that was already kind of an early impact of the GIA's work. Because of the pandemic, it took us a long time to implement the training, but eventually we managed to train 600 tax officials across 40 inland revenue offices of the country. Of course, there is now also an attempt to continue with this. Now, a few words about the training itself. So when we started to work on that, we thought that there are lots of manuals available that we can draw on, but that wasn't really the case because even though it seems to be such a standard instrument, there is very, very limited material actually out there, even on the web. So what we did is we first of all labeled or kind of like envisaged our training as an ethical leadership training with the basic message that everybody can be an ethical leader. That also applies to a constable who works at the street level in the lower ranks of the police in Bangladesh, because that person is a person of authority in the community. And at the very least, he or she is a person of authority who is supposed to act with ethics and integrity in the context of the community and his or her family. So that was the message that we really drove home in each and every session. I have here the outline from the police training, where we have something general, something on personal ethics and integrity. Quite interesting that in both countries, but in Nepal, when I was there now, lots of tax officers saying, "Thank you, you helped me to behave more ethically in my private life." I thought this was a kind of a nice feedback to receive. But then we work on policing values or values for good tax officers. Then on issues of integrity risks and misconduct in the police and in the tax administration. Then a number of, we work on ethical dilemmas and ethical decision-making methods, how they can be resolved or what officers can do in situations of dilemmas. Then we have some specific ethical leadership strategies, and at the end, an evaluation and a certificate that also involved GIAs on it. Our training was then based on what we could source somehow. There are some interesting and good manuals out there for the police, for instance, from DCAF in Geneva. But most of the time, we really had to customize to the local context. So it was customized to Nepal and customized to the tax office and customized specifically to those tax officers that actually meet clients in the field. We needed to get authorizations from our heads of institutions. The training was usually 1 day, 2 half days for Nepal. Clearly, that is not very long. We would have preferred to do 10 weeks, but this is just logistically not possible. And if you compare this to evidence from other areas, usually even 1 day is already a long training because most trainings are only 2 or 3 hours long. We had quite a few senior trainers and co-trainers. You see a few pictures there as well. Our manual, pretty long in both cases, approximately 100 pages. I have also a few photos here for you. You see our police officers still with lots of masks during the pandemic and doing group work there, for instance. Here you see our tax officers in Nepal, just to give you some ideas of what we were doing there. Now, coming then to the evaluation really and what we found there. So first of all, we asked our participants to give us some feedback there. And the feedback was generally quite positive at the end. I mean, you know, they all had a very nice day out. They indicated that this would help them in performing their job. They also gave us some feedback on, for instance, expanding this training to the senior level or how to deal with certain case studies that we used. But the key evidence, of course, came from the field experiment. So what we did at the beginning was to randomly select all our officers in the police in the district in Bangladesh into 2 groups, a treatment and a control group. And in the case of Nepal, we randomized at the level of the office. So we had 1 set of officers in the treatment group and the other one in the control group. The idea was that we would conduct a baseline survey for all our officers. Then our treatment group gets the training. Then we run the endline survey after the treatment group got the training. And then we still have the waitlisted control group at the end, which we, of course, had to train, but they didn't really contribute anymore to the research project itself. What did we look at? So we looked at 3 types of training impacts. I mean, the survey has many, many more things, but I focus here more on what we also presented to the policymakers in the 2 countries. So one type was focusing on ethical competencies. It's really about what do our participants know, what they have learned, what they have understood. Do they feel confident in using the training actually at work? Then we had an aspect on ethical attitudes, intentions, behaviors. This was clearly where we wanted to see the change. I mean, competence is what we thought there we have a good chance of achieving something. But, you know, on the intentions and ultimately the behavior, that's where you really want to see the change. But that's, of course, also hardest to achieve. We based this on the theory of planned behavior, which I'm not going to go more into here now, but just, you know, for those who are interested in theory. And then we also had an aspect on ethical culture. So we asked a lot about ethical norms, descriptive norms, injunctive norms, and a number of questions around that. To give the main findings away, so what we did find is often in our assessment significant improvements when it comes to ethical competencies across the components of the concept there. We also found improvements when it came to intentions and behavior, strangely not attitudes, but intentions and behavior. It's, however, not, I say some improvements because it's not generally on all the indicators that we found. It's sometimes a bit inconsistent. And on ethical culture, we didn't really find much change. I mean, here and there, a question where you think, okay, that's plausible, but on the whole, we cannot really claim to have found a measurable improvement there. That makes, however, also sense because at the time we took the second survey, half of our subjects had not received the training yet. So I think we need to have a different kind of assessment tool for that. Interestingly, the results are actually quite similar in the 2 countries. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to give you some examples from the 2 countries. So it's not going to be everything on Nepal and everything on Bangladesh, but I hope it gives you an idea of what we actually measured and what kind of positive impacts we found and where we didn't really find much of an impact. So let's start with ethical competence. You could say, well, that was the kind of most likely effect that we would find, but this was also, in a way, for us, the most important effect to find, because if our training doesn't raise competencies, I think we are a bit in troubles, not only as teachers, but also for the project. So we looked at 3 components. One is more about ethics code awareness, typically used also in the literature. There's a number of questions that you can ask there. Then what we found there, I give you just right away the kind of headline figure there. So when you ask generally about a civil service code of ethics or code of conduct, I mean, in both cases, Bangladesh and Nepal, the awareness of there is such a code is actually very high, yeah? And which, like, you know, maybe there's probably a lot of social desirability bias at work as well, but generally a very high level of awareness. What was interesting for Nepal is that there was this new IRD, Inland Revenue Department specific code of awareness, which was much less known at the beginning. And what we found there is that we found at the end relatively high degree of awareness, also relatively high degree of readership. And there we found significant differences in our assessment between our treatment and control group. So that certainly gives us also an action point. If you actually adopt a new institution-specific code of conduct or code of ethics, you know, it is worth having a follow-up training in wherever you are, probably. On ethical knowledge, we looked at the contents of the code, and usually the civil service code of conduct, and took out particular provisions and asked whether they are true or false. There we probably need to improve our measurement a little bit, but we did find in some cases positive impacts. In Bangladesh more than in Nepal in this case. There's one example as well. You see generally the level of basic knowledge is already quite high. Ethical skills is perhaps more interesting because this is something about, you know, developing the confidence to approach ethically challenging situations. And this confidence element, efficacy element is quite critical, we believe. And by having gone through the course, we were hoping our officers would develop these kinds of moral efficacy. And there we find across the board on our indicators, we usually find some positive and significant effects. For Bangladesh, it's quite similar what we find there. We find less of an impact on code awareness because we start from such a high level that you cannot find any significant improvement anymore. But clearly it means, you know, training improves competence. We feel quite confident in saying that. However, what about the action? I mean, knowing something is only one part. Oops, here we go. Here we go. Okay. So, in measuring intentions and behaviors, we looked at a number of scenarios that we taught in a different way in the training, and then we followed up on them in the survey. And here's just one example. You know, for reasons of time, I cannot go too much into this now, but we have a tax officer investigating a retail company. Clearly, there is a problem of having underdeclared profits and underpaid taxes. And then you have like some dealing between the different colleagues accepting small amounts of money. Often, in reality, this is a little bit more complex because you have intermediaries involved there, and they manage these kinds of financial dealings then. But the basic idea is there. We had our questions then. I would also accept such an offer. That's an indicator of an intention. And we would, of course, say only if you strongly disagree, is this the kind of answer that we would count. We have a few more here, for instance, being invited for lunch while you are auditing a company, or having gifts that are delivered at home. These are things that happen routinely in Nepal and also in Bangladesh, and in slightly different contexts there, different kinds of integrity violation. And we find here, you can see some numbers here, that on the first one, would accepting a small amount of money, there was actually very high level of awareness that this is not good in the end of the survey, but we also find actually a positive impact of the training. The same applies to the gift that is delivered at home, very high degree of awareness, but we also find a positive impact. Interestingly, serving lunches during an audit, you know, there was much less awareness, and we find even negative effects. It's not significant, but you know, it was definitely puzzling. I think what it tells us is that, you know, we cannot guarantee that we always get what we want there. It may be partially the measurement, but on the whole, promising to find some positive impacts on ethical intentions as a result of the training. Now, let me say a few words about measuring ethical behavior. So here, This is, of course, much, much more difficult. We asked questions in the survey whether our officers or officials in Nepal had been involved in some form of unethical behavior during the last 2 months after, basically after the training had been completed. These are direct questions, and you actually get not very, very good results out of that. So we couldn't really work much with that and didn't find much effect either. The other thing that we did is we were building a number of lab in the field tasks into the survey at the very end. The officers, so we have 3 of them, and I show you one from Bangladesh. So we gave them a matrix, and they had to fill in the one number that was missing here. And they had 10 seconds to think about the answer. And then on the next slide, or the next page on the tablet, they were shown a number, and they were asked, is this the number that you also thought is the correct answer? If their answer was yes, then they would be paid as a performance bonus at the end of the survey. If they said, no, I didn't know it, then they would not be paid. So there's a kind of an incentive to not say exactly the truth. And this is done in a way that we have 5 matrices. The first one is this one, which is easy to answer. And the other 4 are solvable, but extremely difficult in 10 seconds. We did a number of pre-tests with that. So we basically consider a yes on the matrix 2 to 5 as an indicator of dishonesty and therefore unethical behavior. What you see here for our Bangladesh case, the police officers, for Nepal, these numbers are a bit lower, but the pattern is very similar. You can see basically that, first of all, the participating officers, police officers, claim to have solved more than 2 out of the 4 unsolvable matrices. So in other words, about 50% cheat in one way or another. But 80% claim to have solved at least one of the unsolvable matrices. So I guess that maybe, we may talk about whether this is a valid indicator of unethical behavior. But if you want to have an indicator of systemic corruption, I think then this is an interesting one to work with. We also find a positive impact of our training. It's a very small impact, but it is an impact. So I think, it's debatable how much we can do that. We didn't for papers, this is of course very good, but for the future of evaluating the trainings, I think it's something to be discussed. Finally, on the cultures, last point really here, there's many issues we look at. The 2 that I show you here is on descriptive norms and on injunctive norms, and you can see something about the relevance of different types of unethical behavior. So what you see, for instance, at the beginning is my colleagues, have been involved and have accepted gifts during the last couple of months, or last month, and 26% say yes, 50% say that they helped their family during the last couple of months. More than 60%, 2/3 use office equipment for private purposes. So I think that gives you a sense that kind of like unethical behavior is still relatively common there, and this will probably not change from one day to another or after one training. On the injunctive norms, we also see some of the challenges because colleagues, superiors, and family members often think that informal payments should be accepted, but they often don't sit in the training. So that creates a real challenge for making such a training effective. So I think something to consider also for those colleagues who work on norm change. Now, this brings me to my conclusion, and it's definitely time to conclude as well. So we managed to deliver the trainings in our 2 countries there. I do think, we do have some impacts on ethical competence, certainly on behavioral intentions and on behavior with a few caveats, and on ethical culture, at least we can't measure it. But I do think this is also part of the measurement, because if we just do this after all our officers have been trained, it might look slightly different. Now, what about the next steps? And I think this is obviously something still for discussion as well. In a way, I've been quite narrow, right? I'm looking at Nepal and Bangladesh, and for us, you embark on the research project and you think, oh, this is it now, and when we have the result, we write a nice paper. But that's not really, how this works at all, because it's quite clear that this is an iterative process. We developed the first training. Yes, we found a lot of interesting results for sure, but I think what we also really learned is that we need to revisit our training and revise our training, and that we need to revisit and revise our evaluation method, because it should be much more targeted and much better than what we had at the very beginning. As a result of that, and thanks to, in fact, the Bangladesh, in the Bangladesh police, we have been able to do this revision in a second district in Bangladesh, and we started with that last summer. But then, of course, all of you know what happened then in July and August, so we had to pause it naturally. And now, when I was there in January, we had the discussions to restart this second training. Now, this is kind of, we are not completely changing it, but I think this one will be much more, in a way, hard-hitting, we hope so. We can say the same for Nepal, of course. Otherwise, the next step for a place like Bangladesh is, given the at least promising results, is to collaborate with a number of training institutes, Police Staff College, then there's the Academy, Sharda, for those who know Bangladesh. There are so-called in-service district-level training centers that train street-level officers across the 64 districts. So the plan is to work with them in order to institutionalize the training as much as possible and to scale it up, basically, to train as many police officers as possible. And in the current context, of course, this is much more relevant because the police was significantly implicated in the previous regime. And obviously, public trust in the police is rock bottom in Bangladesh. I think that's a fair assessment. And it's not just about the lack of public trust, but it's also a lack of probably the interim government in the police. And at the same time, it's also about the police itself, because many of the police officers have undergone significant trauma during this period. So there's also a need to, really help and invest in the police force. So again, I guess it brings us to the point, when, if not now, this is probably the moment now to do it. And inside the police, there's a lot of interest and willingness and to pursue this now, even more so than what we had a year ago, a great deal more than this. In the case of Nepal, we also want to institutionalize at the level of the Inland Revenue. But there, the interesting part was that other institutions actually came and said, we also want to do ethics training because this is something that will be good for us. So there would be the Customs Administration and the municipalities in particular to tackle one of the most important and, sticky type of corruption in service delivery at the local level. And so we are at the moment looking for some pilot funding. Hopefully that will work out. We don't know. We also have civil society organizations involved there who want to use the training. So there's a center that has been established at one of these NGOs, and they want to use it to train other NGOs across the country on public service ethics, maybe using this also for information campaigns. So I think the lesson from Nepal is more that it was picked up by other sectors who said, like, we want to do this as well. And if anybody is interested in supporting this, of course, please get in touch. But this is what we are working on at the moment. On this note, thank you. Thank you so much for the attention and the opportunity to present. I hope I have made my case for ethics training and especially ethical leadership training. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jan. That's great. Could I ask you now to stop sharing your
Yes.
slides, and we can now pass over to Willeke to respond.
Yeah, good afternoon all. Thank you for inviting me, Paul and Jan. Well, thank you, Jan, for giving such a good summary of in-depth, long-standing research into 2 countries where I've never been. So quite interesting to hear about the systemic corruption and the potential effects of the ethics training. I have a few questions which I would like to ask, and some of them you touched upon in your slide on next steps. So in terms of the position of this ethics and ethical leader training, you touch upon other stakeholders, other sectors, you mentioned toolkits, and I'm wondering also with the national integrity system approach developed by Transparency International. So I know that back then in the methodology, this kind of ethics training was only given small attention. So what is your take on how to incorporate this kind of thinking in the national integrity system? Should it be part of a toolkit? Should it be across all institutions? Is it something more fundamental, like the foundation of an integrity system? And also, is this something you mentioned, broader civil service outroll and also including the private sector? Is this something maybe we should take up on at well, primary school level. So that's my first question on your research in Nepal and Bangladesh. The second one, of course, and you touched upon it in between all the conclusions, always comes back to cultural relativism. So when you mentioned the different impact figures in terms of how the participants perceived that accepting money, accepting a bottle of wine, or accepting lunch, is there still availability to say, okay, lunch, for example, I think it was Nepal, or that's something which is really a strong part of our culture. So indeed, we should get rid of all other forms of corruption, but this is really part of community building or, well, relations. So your cultural relativistic approach on that. And also, when you mentioned, I was really touched upon the welcoming words you gave to the participants, saying everybody can be an ethical leader. Do you have an idea whether they're leaders of these groups of the tax authority and the police officer, whether they perceive their own leadership to be constructive and helping? Maybe they mentioned it to you, or maybe it was not part of a research, but just wondering. And the last part, so yeah, in terms of intentions, behavior, attitude, cultural change, is the final aim to change the entire culture? Is that something we as corruption researchers, which we should aim at, to change cultures in? And maybe a last remark, I'm always wondering how other corruption researchers do it themselves. So how do you prevent a kind of Western take on fighting corruption? How to limit the Western approach of what we perceive to be corruption or not? So a lot of questions, but very positive, and really anxious to hear in depth about your research and reading all the papers. And so.
Thanks very much, Willeke. Okay, Jan, what I propose to do is ask you to capture all those questions, and then we're going to add some more in, so that you've got some time to build a set of responses, because I'm conscious of time, so I want to make sure that people who are keen to ask questions can do so. So can I ask anybody who does have a question, please use the
chat,
putting up your hand facility in Zoom, and that should push your picture to the front of my screen. In the meantime, we've got some questions in the chat, and if people would like to ask those questions directly, is regulatory, which is presumably not actually somebody's name, but is regulatory online and wanting to ask their questions, or shall I just read that one out? It's very straightforward. Are there any international standards like certified ethics professional, maybe ISO or other reputable standards that can be used in this context? Liz David Barrett, I don't know if you want to ask your question, Liz.
Sure, I can do, especially since I fluffed the terminology several times. But Paul, you've written an article about integrity standards. I think it's particularly about public service ethos in the UK. But in that, you use a distinction between compliance-based systems and, I think, values-based systems is the correct terminology. So I was just wondering, in terms of thinking about the type of training that Jan and colleagues were doing, if there were any learnings around which types might be more effective, and maybe you could also just tell us a bit about what the sort of style of the training was in terms of, you talked about ethical dilemmas. Be really interested to hear how you got people talking about those.
Great, thanks, Liz. We have a question from Ivan Zupan from the Assume Water Integrity Network. Ivan, are you on this? Are you here? Again, the question's fairly straightforward. Are you planning on checking the impact on the trained police officers after a longer period of time? It would be important to check whether the opinion has stayed the same or not. So essentially, what's your follow-up? We've got Chiugo Agaji has got her hand up. So do you want to come in?
Yes, thank you so much for this opportunity, and thanks, Jan, for that presentation. Just two quick questions. First is regarding the change in mindset and what you alluded to before around culture. So a lot of these attitudes are cultural in nature, and I think we understand that it will take a lot of time to change it. How would you adopt the KPIs and the metrics to track a change in culture and mindset in such an environment? And secondly, do you think these two, you've done the study in Bangladesh and Nepal, do you think these are able to be extrapolated to other countries as well and other sectors, particularly in Africa? Thank you so much.
Great. Okay, so we've also got another question, but that kind of moves us into a different kind of area. So what I'm going to suggest, Jan, is you have a first shot at now quite a lot of questions. And if you can try and address those as best you can, then we'll come around for another round of questions after that. So Jan, over to you.
Thank you so much. These are really lots of great questions. Thank you, Willeke, first of all, and thank you everybody else. They're no easy answers either. So let me just go maybe one by one. On the other stakeholders, I mean, and how to position the training. So I think it's really, so I mean, in the context of Transparency International, I mean, I can say in Bangladesh, we met TIB. Yeah, they were also very open and very interested in adopting this, and said, well, let's collaborate, when we are going into the next phase, because they can look at the citizen perspective, right? How citizens maybe perceive or experience police officers after they have experienced training, right? It's maybe a bit of a long shot to see the effect there, but at least they were very interested in working together. So I guess there is like a whole, then you have all these different training institutes, right? So it's a pretty large group of institutions. Specifically about the national integrity systems that you mentioned, I don't know, it's not for me to actually advise that here now, I think, but I think simply that training's probably, it's enough, it's how to say, it would be justified to give them a kind of like a separate kind of component, really, because it's something that cuts across the entire public administration. It's not just the anti-corruption sector, you could say. It cuts across public service management, really. And it's also a particular tool. It focuses on providing information. Yeah, and the idea is that individuals, take on new information, and this helps them to update attitudes and intentions and change their behavior. I mean, this is a behavioral change intervention at the end. So it's different from those that focus on monitoring or incentives or so, right? It's a particular type of anti-corruption tool. So that's why I think it will be justified to give it certainly more prominence. Now, on the other questions, cultural relativism, yes. I mean, and in fact, the last question also goes a bit in that direction. So yes, I feel personally sometimes a little bit uncomfortable in coming there as a German and German-British citizen working here and telling the tax officers in Nepal what to do. So I had this discussion with my colleagues in both countries when I was there now in January again. I said, like, are we right in doing this? Because, gift exchange is just very important. It's part of the culture. And of course, you invite someone to a lunch, and of course, you give a gift during the festival season. And my colleague said, like, well, first of all, there are some universal public service values. They were, on all of them were pretty much convinced about that. So we should keep that in mind. And second, like, even if they don't change it immediately, then at least they should reflect upon their practice in light of other values. So they should be able, the training should allow them to question their own practices and to reflect upon it. And then, whether they stick to their old culture or whether they do something else, to follow a new approach is a different matter. But there's a starting point, and that, I mean, if this reflection takes place, it will be better than the stage we had before. Yeah. So I thought this was something I could live with, because it's not that I impose a certain value, but I promote reflection.
You have your own ethical deliberations about that.
Yeah, absolutely. In a way we did.
Yeah.
So there was something about the leaders as well at the very top. So I didn't speak to the Inspector General of the police, but the level below is usually my point of reference. And the same for the Inland Revenue. I spoke to a succession of different directors general. I have the impression from that the two things. So one is, as they support the ethics training, they feel a little bit that they themselves also have a responsibility, a certain commitment. Yeah, if we ask the others to do this training, we actually also should know what's in the training and also take this on board. That's, I think already starting point. And the second thing is that in both cases, there was an openness and an interest in training senior officers. So because they were not the main target of the training. So I would think that maybe they have not led now with more integrity necessarily, but certainly there was an openness to it, yeah, and a willingness to engage, right? You can see I'm quite cautious before I come to the KPI question in terms of how far I'm willing to push this. Something about changing culture, I think I answered this because, maybe we cannot say we change behavior right away, but we focus on something else. There was a very interesting question about standards and whether there is some ISO type standards for ethics training. Not to my knowledge. Generally, I had the impression there are just very few ethics trainings out there. Yeah. And even when you see this in the UK context or Canada, Australia, wherever you go, it's not really that you have a manual that you can just take. There are few exceptions. DCAF as a DCAF for Geneva is a good example for law enforcement, which has such a manual. So that's probably some way to go. Then, Liz, your question about, or your comment about compliance and value-based approaches to ethics and integrity management. So, I think at the end of the day, our training is more value-oriented, simply because we are teaching personal ethics with a strong focus on personal values. We cover the professional values, yeah, and the institution-specific values. Something about Paul's integrity starts with the institution, yeah, all of that. And at the end, there's a lot about the dilemmas and the leadership. So it's very value-based. However, for civil servants, you cannot go without the rules. I mean, because there are disciplinary codes, there are the codes of conduct, which are often not value-based, but much more focused on what is allowed and what is not. So we have always a strong session on these are the rules, and we use that session to indicate or to teach our officers that the rules can't answer all the questions, because they may be in conflict, or there may be no rules, or they may be discredited, right? There are lots of different things. So yes, it is rule-based, but only up to a point, because as an officer with integrity and an ethical leader, you need to be able to question them and reflect upon them. Yeah. So I hope that answers that question. So ultimately, it's more value-based. Yeah. And your point about the style. So I think what was one of the nicest part of the training, which took a long time to develop, because I think I was twice in Nepal and Bangladesh. We had to do it during the pandemic. It was a bit difficult. So with lots and lots of interviews to understand what are the corruption problems or the kind of problems of unethical behavior in these institutions. And we could use that to then develop case studies, right? So we had a number of these scenarios, and we have a whole bank of scenarios for both countries and institutions. And then we would use them in the session on misconduct and say, look, here's a situation, someone gets a lunch, or the superior asks you to do something which is unethical, or so what do you do? And it was interesting. I mean, nobody knew really exactly how it would work, but the trainers generally were very positive. They said officers, after they had gone through the first 2-3 sessions, they were all very open to share their views and their experience. And they said, sometimes I wish someone could have recorded in the background, because it would have been a long, list of all kinds of ethical problems that appear. What also came out of it, and I think that's a really important point for the work that we all do, is that the working conditions are often just very bad. Let's put it like this. They're simply bad. Not just low salaries, but let's say police officers with no cars, no fuel, no laptops, no place where they can sleep and rest, and so on. So, I mean, the conditions are often really dreadful. And so one thing that we learned through this corruption, through these interviews, is that often it's something about, you know, generating resources from the public in order to perform your job. It's still corruption. They shouldn't do that. But there is this kind of, you know, corruption is a bit more complicated than what I usually read previously. It almost felt like the new public management gone mad because, you know, officers were actually sourcing additional income in order to be able to manage their stations. So quite extreme. And I think it might be a conversation for another day, really. So, but this kind of very interactive style, talking about what is their everyday experience, that really worked and got them all engaged. That brings me to certainly the point on other countries and other sectors. So, you know, this is highly tailored, right? I mean, there is a general framework, but it's quite tailored. It's very tailored because we need to have the rules from Nepal. Otherwise, it makes no sense. We need to have the rules from Bangladesh and from the police, otherwise it doesn't work. We need to have the case studies that reflect the life of police officers in Bangladesh. Otherwise, the training doesn't really have the impact it's supposed to have. So this means that when we are now adapting the training to senior officers in the police in Bangladesh, we already have a serious revision task on our hands, because we can increase the level of what we are discussing with them. With senior officers, they all have a university degree. You can start to talk about ethics theory. You can't really do this with constables. So there are things that we need to integrate there. If we were asked whether so passport office was such an example where there was a clear interest in Bangladesh. So we were discussing this, that, well, you know, it would take us certainly 2 or 3 months to adapt our training in terms of regulation and especially understanding what those officers do in their day-to-day life. This means we can, of course, bring it to Africa, and we have a manual, more than 100 pages, and I think there should be a manual attached to it that says about how to adapt it. That's maybe, I think, the idea you are giving me here. So it can, of course, be brought to other countries and other sectors, but it needs customization. Otherwise, not gonna have the effect it's supposed to have. Have I answered it? Oh, there was one question about how long the effect would last. So ideally, we would have enough resources to survey our participants again, like maybe a year later. I think, of course, you know, realistically, the effect will diminish over time. It's just the nature of the reality. But I think this also is one of the feedback, right? You need to, I mean, doing one training and having found some positive effect is very promising, but it's really only a starting point. It's a small starting point. So probably we need to do this repeatedly and do it with more officers in the same sector or same institution, and roll it out to more institutions. If that's the case, I think you can reinforce and sustain an effect. I mean, I'm confident enough there, given that I teach at a university, that this will be possible. Yeah. Okay. On the KPIs, you know, I think it's in a way implied by it, right? I mean, we have now better questions where you really know, this is what we taught, this is what we wanted. We ask for this now in the survey, and then in the next step we can ask similar questions, of course, a year later, right? So then you have long-term cultural change.
Brilliant, thanks, Jan. There's several more questions now in the chat, so I'm going to ask people if they want to just say briefly what their question is, and I stress briefly because we're pressed for time. So is Ave Pandi online wanting to ask their question?
I saw this about spiritual leaders.
Spiritual leadership.
This is a brilliant comment, actually.
Yeah.
Because they're yeah.
Okay, well, we'll see if Ave comes online. In the meantime, Luis Ventura, you have a question too. Luis, we can't hear you. It doesn't look like you're on mute, but we can't hear you. There seems to be a technical problem.
Yeah, the audio, I can see it as well.
Yeah, so I'll read your comment out. The environment surrounding police officers is also determinant of their behaviour. Is there any way of cross-checking the effect of the environment on the training? If you see corruption as also a form of problem solving, are there any alternatives to solve the problems without recurring to corruption? So some institutional environment is needed for things to work without recurring to corruption, and there's a requirement for the training to be effective. So that sort of the institutional environment issue is an important one there. Then we have a question from Najib Kabuchi on social impact being an important dimension to this. A question from Max Kremadis Hashemi. Hi, Max. Nice to see you online. Have you noticed any difference according to the rank of the people who are taking the training? Is there more willingness at different levels? And then John Devitt. John, are you online? Do you want to ask your question? No response from John. So Richard Common. Richard, are you there?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Sorry, very interesting. Someone said that you probably need more than an hour to get through all this and everything, and absolutely fascinating study. But I just wonder, having been involved in sort of civil service type training across different things, very often it's used as a system of rewards for the people who attend the training, and in fact after the training very little changes, and that's because there's no real consideration of changing the structures that encourage the behavior in the first place. I mean, the most extreme example I saw was years ago. I was in the Republic of Georgia, and they completely abolished the highway patrol. They couldn't do anything with it apart from abolish it and reform it again. So I just wonder if there's a sense, and I don't know, Jan, if you talk to senior ministers about this, how about changing the structure of the public service in a way that prevents this from happening in future, as well as very important training efforts? Just a thought.
Thanks, Richard. And John Devitt, who has problems with his microphone, so essentially asking, have you looked at the work of Dunphy and Donaldson on integrative social contracts theory, ties that bind, that work, and link that to training? So I'm now going to give you the impossible task, Jan, of responding to all of that in 2 minutes.
Great. Okay. So given the comments, the notes I took, so Richard, I come straight back to you. So yes, I mean, in our case, it wasn't a reward because, we randomly selected who was supposed to attend. So there, I mean, initially you can imagine that some of the police officers, senior officers said like, oh, but we can do the selection. We're like, no, you can't. We have to do that. So that in that respect, was out. However, there's an interesting point about, can you also change the structure? Now, I mean, in Bangladesh for a long time, it has not been changed. Now, maybe, I think there is some hope, but then things will change slowly. But there was a very interesting comment we got from one of the officers in charge of a police station in one of the districts where we went. And he said, well, even if we now have better, a better institutional environment, better working conditions, and, maybe higher salaries and, less posting around and so on, unless we get the mindset change first, many of these structural changes would not work. Right. So he was convinced that first you need to work on the values and the integrity of the individual officers so that they actually know how to operate in an upgraded environment. And I thought that was actually quite a nice comment that we received there. I'm not sure whether it sounds naive from your point of view, but at least I'm sharing that. Yeah. I think that's my last point. Have I forgotten one? Social impact, institutional environment. There was this point, Ventura, about the institutional environment. I think I addressed this point to some extent by saying that, many of the officers are working in an environment where corruption is very endemic and deeply embedded, but it's a significant part of the corruption that occurs there is not exactly, is also there in order for them to do their own job, right? Because the conditions are so bad. And that brings us back to Richard's point. There's clearly a need, of course, to improve and upgrade the institutional environment. Yeah. I guess at the end of the day, ethics training as an area of to build integrity, to reduce corruption in the public service, but also to signal to citizens and maybe governments that there is a willingness to invest in integrity and ethical leadership. I think it's something that hasn't really been tried very much, and to do this at scale has at least there's some, how to say, prospect that it could add something. That's, I think, my final point for it.
No, that's great. Thanks, Jan. And as you can see from the questions, this is a topic that generates really significant interest, and it's clearly an area that we need to do much more work on. So thank you for being at the forefront and in the vanguard of actually leading this research. I think it's of huge potential significance for developing our more robust systems to guard against corruption.
Can I
Thank
say
you,
one
everybody.
quick say, Paul? Can I say one thing, which brings me back to the point about Africa and how it travels? I think one dilemma is sometimes it's a logistical dilemma that we all face when we implement this, because I think if you want to do this effectively, you need to adapt the training to the context, and you need to invest quite a bit of time, and you need to also deliver it in person and give the officers or public servants an opportunity to speak freely, and for them, it's not exactly a reward, but it's at least kind of like a nice environment they're working in. If you, however, do online trainings, as we experience at many of our universities, where you have an hour and to go through some slides or so, I don't think that's going to shift the needle very much. I think it's not.
I'm sure that's right. And
so there's a logistical challenge to it.
Yeah,
right?
I fear this being online and just an hour has
Sorry.
maybe demonstrated precisely some of the impact that you're talking about. But thank you, everybody, for giving up the hour to attend this seminar. Thank you in particular to Jan and to Willeke for their contributions to all of the questions that were asked. And I look forward to as many of you as possible joining us for the next seminar. A reminder again, Thursday, the 20th of February at the same time, 1 o'clock to 2 p.m. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Okay. Thank you.